Hello and welcome to our course Marketing Management Part 1. We are discussing buyer behavior, and I will give you just a recap of what we have discussed in last class. So, we started discussing about evaluation of alternatives, and in evaluation of alternatives I have talked about three things: belief, behavioral intention and attitude and behavior. These three things play a very important role basically in understanding the overall consumer behavior, their choices. So, I talked about the first thing, which is belief, that belief is a basically descriptive statement about a particular object. So, that sums up your opinion about something. Then we talked about behavioral intention, basically it is a plan based on your belief that how you are going to react to something. Attitude we talked about, it is a learned predisposition to respond to an object or a class of objects in a consistently favorable or unfavorable way. So, there are some important things like learned disposition, and it is always towards a specific object, and then we talked about it is consistent and either favorable or unfavorable. Then we talked about the three inputs that go into the evaluation of alternatives, that the important criterias, then what is the ranking of those important criterias, and then what are the basically the cutoff or what are the minimum expected from a brand for to be chosen on that particular criteria. So, all these things, these three important things mix up, and then they go in a decision rule, and then we get basically the purchase decision at the end. And if you see these three things, these three inputs, based on these three inputs, the processing basically could take two types of form, which is like consumer's choice model. We have talked about compensatory versus non-compensatory. So, I started talking about the compensatory model, where that consumers evaluation of a particular brand is basically sum of the importance rating of a particular attribute and how a particular brand fares on that important attribute in consumers perception. So, basically the overall attitude towards a brand is a basically summation on important attributes multiplied by the rating on that attribute of a brand. So, I have explained to you through an example wherein I have taken 6 brands. They were rated on 6 important criteria. This was about a laptop purchase. So, I told you that these are 6 important criteria. Consumers have also rated, this particular consumers have also rated the importance score of different attributes. Now, if you apply this Fishbane multi attribute model, then you can calculate basically the overall rating of a particular brand, and we get the rating which is summed up here, and then you can see that, as I have told in the last class, the brand 1 is probably rated highest by this consumer based on his importance rating of different attribute and how the particular brand in his perception fares on that attribute. So, based on this consumers rating are given, overall rating are given. Then we also talked about, supposedly there is a second consumer whose choice criteria differs, in the sense he gives less importance to weight, he gives less importance to basically the processor speed, then he gives slightly more importance to probably weight and probably some other criteria like service warranty. What will be basically the impact on the difference in all these criteria? However, for the simplicity, we have not changed basically the consumer rating on of different brands on those things. So, you can see that as we change the importance rating, we get basically the different overall ratings, which is I mean commonly that is something which is expected. So, you understand based on that why the consumers overall evaluation of the brand is different, it gets illustrated here. So, this was basically the compensatory model, and you can observe one thing is that consumers have a sort of trade off if a particular brand does not do well on a particular criteria, but it does significantly well on the other criteria, then consumer can basically trade off for a higher performance on the one criteria by the lower performance on the other criteria, and that is why this model is called as compensatory model. Instead of compensatory model, if consumer goes for non-compensatory model, then there are different possibilities in which he can make the decision. So, there are most importantly there are 4 types of decision rules. First one is a basically conjunctive rule, and here what happens is, you see I am taking the same example, I am not changing anything like importance rating of the different attributes and rating of the brands on the those attributes, but you will see that here that in the conjunctive rules the consumer sets the minimum cutoff value that he expects from a brand on that particular attribute. So, consumer expect minimum value of 3 out of 5 on this price. Any brand which is less than 3 is being eliminated. So, here because that minimum cutoff is 3, the brand 5 and brand 6 are eliminated. Similarly, if you look at basically the weight, the minimum cutoff is basically 4, and you see the B1 and B5 are basically eliminated. Then we take this criteria processor speed, the minimum cutoff is 3, so B4 is basically eliminated here, and then when we take basically this battery performance, you see the B3 is being eliminated. So, what we are left with is basically only this brand B2 which fares above, or it does well probably, or its values are above on all the cutoff criteria, and we get basically this at the end the B2 is being selected if the conjunctive rule is applied here. The other basically, the second basically a non-compensatory model is this disjunctive rule. Basically in this disjunctive rule you will say this the consumer basically instead of using all the attributes which were given which could be important, he just chooses very few couple of them and sets a minimum cutoff value corresponding to those critical attributes, and then evaluates the brand which perform above those cutoff values. So, here you see the consumer has just 3 attributes: price, weight and graphics as the 3 most important criteria for him, and then he rates then he see basically which brands does better on the. So, any brand that does on any of this one criteria is being chosen, like because this brand 1 does well on this price, so its score is 5. If we look at this weight basically this so when we look at the weight, B3 is basically doing as good as what is the minimum value, and then when we look at basically the graphics, probably this brand B4 is doing as good as what is required. So, based on this you get basically B1, B3 and B4 meet minimum for at least one important criteria and thus are acceptable. So, consumer can choose any one of them if he is using disjunctive rule. Then basically comes the third non-compensatory rule, which is elimination by aspect. Now, this is something which you need to understand. What happens in elimination by aspect is that based on the important criteria, based on the importance rating of the consumer, he first rank off he ranked the different attributes. So, if I take you back and you can see that slide where I have given the importance rating, you can see here the most important criteria was processor speed, the second was price, and then the third and fourth you can take any, I mean like in this case there is a tie, so you take any of this. So, I might have taken this battery performance and then graphics and then weight and the service warranty. This is the importance of the order of the importance of different attributes. Now, first consumer in elimination by aspect rule, first he will basically put the attributes on this importance rating, importance ranking. Once he has done that, he will also decide basically in the next step what is the cutoff value for those the criterias. Now once he has done that, what he will start doing is that he will start eliminating the brands. First he will look at the brand which have the minimum cutoff value of 4 on the most important criteria. So here you will see that brand B4 is eliminated. Here if I say that processor speed, and if I look at 4 as the basically minimum criteria, you will see this brand V4 is being eliminated. So I am left with 5 brands now. The next thing is I will look into the second most important criteria, which is price, and for price again this cutoff value is basically 4. So he will go back and see like on price how many brands are doing better than basically 4. So you will see that B6 is eliminated, B5 is eliminated, B3 is eliminated, and B2 is also eliminated. However, we have also seen that B4 was eliminated at the first stage itself. So we are only left with B1 in the case of elimination by aspect method. Finally in this case again you have B1 being selected by elimination by aspect rule. And the last type of basically non-compensatory rule that exists is basically lexicographic decision rule, that what happens is consumer again like elimination by aspect ranks the criteria in order of the importance, then selects brand that perform best on the most important attribute. If 2 or more brands tie, they are evaluated on the second most important attribute. This continues through the attributes until one brand outperforms the other. So again the B1 would be selected as it perform best on the processor speed, our consumers most important attribute. So these are basically the non-compensatory rule which a consumer use. In basically real life situation you will see that consumer can use basically a combination of these different rules. It could also be possible that they will use compensatory plus non-compensatory. So first they will eliminate some of the options through non-compensatory. So they will eliminate some of the options through the non-compensatory rule, and then probably they can go for the compensatory model to evaluate the brands and come out with the overall ratings of the brand. So the next stage in the buying decision process is the purchase, and if you look at the purchase decision, there are couple of like brand, store, quantity, time and payment policy. So like many times you will see that the consumers will not zero down on their brand choice very specifically. So those decisions exist till probably, and the decision of brand may exist till the store, and there could be a situation where consumer will first decide the store and then basically choose the brand, where the store loyalty is very high. So these two decision of store choice and the brand choice go hand in hand. Then where consumer will purchase will also depend on the quantity is going to purchase. Like if you have to just purchase a small item then probably or in a lesser quantity, then probably you may be ready to pay a bit of more premium and you will purchase it from the nearest kirana shop. On the other side, when you have to purchase something for your monthly stock, you would like to go to a place where probably you can get a bulk deal. So quantity plays an important role in the purchase decision, and also the time basically, because you will see that timing is also important. Some of the stores timings will not match with the consumer's time of the requirement or the what the consumer prefer to have. So all those things will come into the picture. Then the last thing that that could also play a very important role is the payment policy. Though its role in basically the B2B marketing is probably more important, seems like look like more important, but you will also see that payment policy could exist to be a critical thing in the purchase decision in some of the markets where the consumers prefer to have something on the credit basis, or probably they would like to defer the payment process, and or maybe they would like to prefer paying in terms of the installment. Payment policy could be important in big ticket purchases also, where you get a better basically the financing terms from the supplier or the dealer who is providing this the product also arranges for a good financing options for you. So, all these things basically not as a standalone, they can basically work together, and consumer has to make a decision based on the overall of all these 5 things. So, once we have evaluated the different alternatives, we have decided which brand to be chosen, which from which stores to be, from basically overall evaluation of the alternatives. So, when we know about the different ratings of the different brand, the next stage of the buying process is basically the purchase decision, and in this purchase decision there are various important various important decisions that have to be made by the consumer or the buyer, and these decisions have basically, they are not standalone, there is a correlation or they are related to each other. So, these important decisions are the choice of the brands, the choice of the store, the quantity that you want to purchase, the time at which you want to purchase, and then payment policy. So, some of these things are extremely important in the purchase decision, and you will see that they are correlated also, because you may prefer or at the end of the your compensatory evaluation of the brands, you may think that possibly I can take these 2 brands, they are very closely related, and you may zero down your choices on these 2 brands. But if you find out the brand which was evaluated as a with a rating of 3.9 instead of the best being rated as 4, but in your the store that you prefer, or the store which is nearest to you does not carry the brand which has the highest rating, then probably in many cases you will not like or you will not mind taking the other brand which is being rated next to the first brand. So, the choice of the store is also a very critical thing in the overall decision making process. So, you will see that brand and store choice basically have a correlation, and consumers try to basically sort of again basically they have to see in which place probably or which store the preferred brands are available. If the brand loyalty is very high and for the kind of product he is looking for is very important to him, maybe he will look for the store where the most preferred brand is available. In that case he will not probably go with his preferred choice of the store, but many times it will also happen that you will prefer a store instead of probably a brand. And along with these 2 important decisions is the decision of the quantity, because you see the quantity plays a very important role in the purchase decision. When we have to purchase something in the small quantity, then probably it will not make sense for a consumer to visit far away place, because the cost of the transport might be higher than probably what little bit you save by paying extra to your nearest store. So, in that case probably the quantity comes as a critical factor in the decision making process. Then again the time also come, like the timing at which probably certain the stores are probably shopping places are open, how they basically are convenient to the time at which you would like to shop. So, those things comes into the picture. And the last thing which could be very critical basically is the payment policy, because certain at certain times what may happen, because a certain brands or the producer or the supplier will come out with very lucrative financing policy for different kind of options that they have, and that make their option overall better than probably the brand as a standalone brand or a product that you would prefer. You can see the effect of payment policy in the automobile purchase or all big ticket purchases, where because of the financing policy also there is a switching tendency in the consumers. So, these are some of the important decisions. However, this purchase decisions, you will see that though they are correlated, they have a situational influence. Like you you may have a very positive attitude towards certain brand, but to follow basically the social norm, your intention to purchase and your actual purchase sometimes will not match, because to abide by a certain group or to conform with the certain norms, social norms, you may not prefer certain product or the brand, because they will not be acceptable to the people you respect, or the people whom you look forward. So because your acceptability will go down by attaching yourself with those product or the brands, you tend to basically change your options in certain cases. Then also the with the purchase decision is an important thing, which important variable that comes into the picture is the perceived risk. It is about the uncertainty attached with the product that is basically is perceived as a risk, and there could be different type of risk attached with any purchase. It could be in the form of the functional risk, whether the product performs well or not, whether the purchase of the product will lead to some kind of financial loss, or probably it will take you to some kind of a mental distress, or it could lead you to basically some kind of time loss. So these are basically the different kind of the risk that exist with a different product, and that plays a very important role in the purchase decision. One of the important job of the marketeers is to understand the different risk attached with the product purchases, and try to minimize the risk, try to reinforce to the consumers that what they purchase is basically the right decision. So that will basically also help them in alleviating some of their fears. Many a times you will also see that a consumer will not make a decision of purchasing, they will defer the decision of the purchase, or say they will just not purchase, because this could happen because of the reasons illustrated in the slide. You can see that a person might be too busy at a particular point of time, and then he thinks that this is something which is important purchase, I should not go for it because I need to devote the time here, so he will defer the decision. On the other side, you will also see there is a tendency among the consumers that then in the expectation they will defer their decision of the purchase for some time. Like if I am looking for basically a two-wheeler to drive within inside this IIT Kanpur campus, but at this point of time I am deferring my decision for the next year, because I expect by the mid-year next year there will be a lot of new models available in the market, which could probably be better than which could be overall better deal than the existing options available in terms of their mileage, in terms of their power that being delivered by those products. So in expectation of the better new product, consumer defer their purchases. And also one thing you will see, particularly in certain technology products, electronic products, consumer basically defer their purchase decision, because they expect that in future there will be a price drop. So in expectation of the price drop, people will basically defer their decision. The last stage of this buying process is basically post purchase evaluations. Once you have purchased something, you will basically evaluate something. So post purchase is basically could be understood in three ways, that there could be three possible outcome with respect to two variable. What were you expecting, what was your expected performance of the product, and how actually it has performed in reality. So if your expected performance is equal to basically the performance delivered by the product, then probably you will be in a neutral position, you will be fine with that purchase. However, if your expectations are not met by the actual performance of the product, you will feel unsatisfied, and your chances of repurchase in the future will go down. There could be a third situation where your product's actual performance has exceeded the basically the expected performance. Then in that case the consumer will feel delighted, and he will be very satisfied with your product, and then he will most likely will have a, if he will go for another purchase, he will repeat the purchase, and he many times it is also possible he will recommend it to the other consumers also. Related with this post purchase evaluation is a concept called cognitive dissonance. Something which is very important from the marketing perspective is that cognitive dissonance is made of two words, cognitive, that knowledge, and dissonance is basically a contradiction. So, contradictory knowledge basically, if you can say that. So, it is in the form of two contradicting beliefs that a consumer develops because of a purchase. So, just for an example, I will explain to you the cognitive dissonance in a way that I was consuming a particular kind of food, or I was consuming a particular brand of noodles. Suddenly that noodle brand gets into a sort of trouble that it has certain ingredients which were not good for the health. Though this process of basically experimentation with the content of the food and all the legal and the regulatory process will go on, but consumers will be feel distressed because of the various reports that comes into the media, and then the doubts get developed and people started talking that this product is not good. So, you want to eat something because you are eating it for a long time, and at the same time you know if it is not good for health, at least at that particular point of time, that you start thinking that it might not be good for health. So, these are basically the contradicting thought, and they will create a mental basically distress kind of situation, mental distress, which our consumers will not like to purchase, and there is a general tendency among the consumers to reduce basically any such type of cognitive dissonance in themselves. So, to explain this cognitive dissonance model, basically a linear model, how it happens is you basically have a attitude behavior inconsistency because of the purchase, because two different or contradictory thoughts comes into your mind, then basically dissonance is being created and in your mind, and what happens is to resolve that dissonance or distress stage, you change your attitude. Either you basically stop eating that type of noodle, or you will start ignoring the basically the negative belief or the thoughts which are coming against that noodle. So, basically that is attitude change, and the result of this attitude change is that dissonance is basically reduced. So, there are basically three major ways in which the cognitive dissonance gets reduced, is that you acquire new information that will increase the harmony. So, you go further, and it can work in both way. You can stop consuming the product, or you will still consume, but you are able to remove the negative thoughts. By acquiring new information, you get more research done about the product, that basically tells you clearly whether this product is harmful or not harmful. If the product is not harmful, you will feel happy that you are consuming basically something good, and then you will continue eating that. However, if you find out that it was not good for health, then probably you will get convinced and you will stop eating if you are health conscious. Other thing is change one or more beliefs associated with the dissonance. So, that is what, like either change your belief of it is being harmful, or you change your belief that you would like to eat. And the third thing is that you reduce the importance of the cognition. So, sort of the thing like where you start ignoring the negative news or contradicting thought themselves, that creates the cognitive dissonance. So, this is about the cognitive decision, and I have completed all the 5 stages of buying process in the context of consumer decision making or B2C process. I end this session here, and we will continue talking about some of the more theories in the consumer behavior in the next few sessions. Thank you very much.